Hello and welcome to B2B Revenue Leaders. I'm your host, Dustin. This podcast is brought to you by Testimonial Hero. With Testimonial Hero, you can film anywhere in the world, remotely or on site, and create written and video content from a singular interview. Learn more at testimonialhero.com. On this episode, I'm joined by Heather Jacoby, who is the senior creative producer at Testimonial Hero. And this one's a bit meta, since I'm interviewing one of our senior interviewers about interviewing. Heather walks us through her philosophy of interviewing, how she developed her interview skills, the type of questions to ask and when to ask them, and she also reveals her favorite interview question. Hey, Heather, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I'm super excited to have you here. Aside from having Sam, who's our CEO, it's the second time having someone from Testimonial Hero, and you interview people all day. That's your job as a creative producer here, so don't judge my interview skills too hard. But we're going to talk about interviewing for the most part. So everything from how to interview people who won't open up to question order, making people comfortable, all that stuff you do day in, day out. But before we were on the air, you mentioned that a good interview can be transformative.
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that? Let's dive in there.
Yeah, I think if an interview is done right, you have the ability to transform, and transformative can be several different definitions, but you can transform a space into a safe and comfortable space. You can transform the person from an anxious person into a more comfortable expert in their field. You can transform a subject into something that was previously maybe boring or overdone into something that's really layered and nuanced. And when you're doing an interview correctly, and when you're approaching it from that lens of always wanting to search for the meaning, search for what do you have to learn and gain from this? What can we connect over? It has the ability to be super transformative and sometimes even life-changing. So not to oversell it, but
yeah. So I like how you mentioned learning there, like this sense of curiosity going into an interview.
Mm-hmm.
Two questions actually. How important is that? And how do you make yourself curious when maybe the topic isn't the most exciting thing that you're passionate about?
Oh, that's a really good question. So when working with Testimonial Hero, I have had the pleasure of doing thousands of interviews for thousands and hundreds and thousands of different companies. And I've never had that moment where I'm like, oh, this is boring. And I think that maybe that is something that is innate to somebody who likes to interview, that maybe most interviewers will come from that place of being really engaged and really wanting to learn. Maybe that's just how we are as a whole, or maybe that's just how I am. But I will say there are moments in interviews that they can start to lag a little bit. And what helps in those moments is just reconnecting with the person, reconnecting with what brought them there. A lot of the people that we interview are experts in their field. I am interviewing everyone from like maybe entry-level positions all the way to CEOs. And even at every single level, the people that I'm interviewing, the quality and the caliber, they always have something to teach me. There's always something to learn. And just connecting with them on that level, and it makes it really easy and really fun.
Nice. Yeah, I haven't done thousands, but I think we're, episode 60 here now. And that's my favorite part of this actually is I bring people who are smarter in certain things than I am, and then I learn a bunch of stuff from them. So it keeps the brain young. It keeps me going a little bit, which is nice.
Exactly. And have you had those moments where you're like, oh, this is boring? Like they don't usually happen.
No, not really. No.
Yeah, I think that's the great thing about human connection too, is interviews are just another opportunity to connect. And there's moments that it's going to feel forced when you just think about the overall format of an interview. Oh, I go in and they ask me questions. It will feel very forced at first. But once you get down to the actual process and getting into it, you find you become really invested in that person and their story and their success and their challenges and pain points. And it's a lot easier when you're invested and you genuinely care. And that happens innately with interviewing, I think.
For sure. Yeah. And I want to go into some of those tips too on how to make people comfortable. But before that, I think what I'm wondering in my head and some listeners might be is, let's backtrack a little bit. How did you end up being an interviewer? Because I don't think anyone goes to school and thinks I'm going to interview people for a living and that's going to be my job. Maybe you did. Maybe I don't know about that school, but yeah. How did you end up there?
That's a really good question. I got my degree in communication studies, and then I went and got a master's degree in communication studies as well. And I spent about 5 or 10 years on film sets in varying capacities. Started as a production assistant, which is basically your runner for snacks and stuff for the stars on the scene. And then moved my way up to production coordinator and different skill sets there. I've been a teacher. I've managed a sushi and hibachi restaurant. I've done all of these different things. I worked for a dumpster company at one point in time. So if you look at my resume, it's very varied and it's very vast, but the common thread is probably going to be that I love to teach and I love to learn. And there is a very beautiful like synchronicity that happens when you're interviewing is you get to do both at the same time. And I think that's probably what drew me to it. Just that hunger and that thirst for always learning and always wanting to teach. And yeah, I think that's what brought me to here and why I stay is because no day looks the same. And every day I get to meet some pretty incredible people.
That's awesome. Yeah, it's important to keep it going. Like you mentioned, why you do this, why you stay. You actually found something you're passionate about and you enjoy. So it makes working a hell of a lot easier when that's the case.
100%.
Yeah. So one thing you are really good at, like I've got this feedback from customers, I've seen some of your interviews, is making people feel comfortable and open up. And I know part of that is just an innate thing that you've developed over the years, but I'm sure there's got to be some tips and strategies there. When you go into an interview and you notice someone's maybe a little nervous, a little shaky, maybe a little scared, what do you do? Like, how do you make them feel comfortable?
Yeah, I know for a fact that there were big parts of my career and big parts of my life that I did have to invest in how to learn this. I did have to train myself in how to be an engaged communicator. And now that you're asking, it comes very naturally. So I'm like, oh, I don't know. I'm just comfortable and chill. But no, I know at the beginning, it was a very long road for me. I'm very ADHD. I'm very hyperactive. I have grown up my life just being a very hyper person, and focusing in on somebody and learning their story took a lot of focus, a lot of concentration for a very long time. And so now that I'm at this point in my career and I've invested hundreds and thousands of hours into it, I can tell you, oh, it comes naturally. Oh, you just engage with the person on their level. But no, I would say that a lot of the best interviewers probably start out as some of the worst. You do need to really understand what the social climate of an interview is the second you get into it. And there needs to be an innate understanding between you and the other person before they've even fully fleshed you out. And that's hard. That's hard to do on any level. There's no like magic rule book that you can follow. It's just something you need to invest hours and hours into and engage with on a very genuine and curious level. There's a gentle curiosity that comes into play whenever you're interviewing somebody, whenever you're engaging with somebody. And especially if they're nervous or they're closed off, that curiosity needs to sort of take a back seat to your care for them, your understanding and what the situation is. So if I were to give like silly little things that I do, it would be maybe asking questions, or we don't have to start interviews right away. And the way I like to combat a lot of anxiety is going to be through information. And I do believe that the number one way to combat anxiety is through learn, right? If I'm anxious about something, it's probably because I don't fully know what I'm getting into. And I would like a little more information about what's going to happen next. So that is one of the first things we do right off the bat when people enter into spaces with us as creative producers. We make sure they know how it's going to look. This is what we're doing first. This is what we're doing next. We'll have plenty of opportunity to ask questions here. At the end, we're going to have another round where you can ask questions and we'll tell you next steps. We're always signposting, always letting people know when they engage with us what they can expect at every level. That helps a lot with people who are more anxious or maybe just curious about what's going on. We're not just leading them blindly through the dark. There is a set and a series of steps that we follow. And then when you have people who are a little more closed off, those are my favorite because that just gives me a chance to actually work my skills and become more engaged in the subject matter. Usually when someone's closed off, it's either A, because they're feeling like maybe their content isn't worth the time and they're just trying to, oh, it's not worth it to say that. I'll just, or it could be a defense mechanism. A lot of times people come into this with their walls up. And in either case, you need to establish yourself as a safe person, as an individual who, no matter what comes out of your mouth, I want to say it, I want to hear it, and I want you to say it. I want to give you this opportunity to be an expert at whatever you're talking about. And usually when that happens, once you're able to create that space, that person can open up a lot more and feel a lot more comfortable in sharing their journey with you.
Yeah, no, I think those are really great tips, especially the walking them through it. This may be a bit of a weird or dumb comparison, but if I'm at the dentist, I want the dentist telling me what they're doing, not just, ooh, or like a weird sound. And I got to wonder what the hell is going on. So I think it does help ease some of that anxiety. On that topic of, you mentioned people who are closed off. I had this guy named Eric on the podcast a few weeks back. He related personality types to birds, and it stuck in my head. But he had the eagle who swoops in and does whatever they want, and the owl who like sits back and think and maybe more introverted. I'm curious, do you adapt kind of the type of bird you are to the person? And I'm thinking this from, you're very outgoing and sociable and bubbly. But if someone is like very reserved, think like philosophy teacher type person, do you tone it back or change how you act? Like, how do you interact with them?
Yes and no.
Okay.
Again, this is the great thing. And also the awful thing about interviewing is that it really is a case by case basis. And that is where your intuition from coming from hours and hours of interviewing people is going to kick in, because there are going to be people who are really low energy that respond better to your high energy. And then there are just as many people who are low energy who are going to respond worse to high energy and need you to come down to their level. So figuring that out it is something I like to do. It is because at the end of the day, it's not about me. It's not about my outgoingness, my happiness, my energy level. It's about what is making this person most comfortable in the moment. And yeah, I will turn into an eagle, an owl, a sparrow, whatever you need to feel comfortable in the moment. I will definitely try and calibrate that to the people I'm with, because if people were birds, then when somebody's identifying as a sparrow, they probably don't want to be interviewed by an eagle, right? They're probably like, I'm going to get eaten alive here. So yeah, coming to the people from their level and making sure that you're connecting at an energy level, at a human level is really important. And it is something that I strive to do. Some of us creative producers are better at it than others. My energy level is always going to be a little higher than it needs to be. But I really do try.
Yeah, it's funny. I kind of picture the meme out there where it's like someone thinking in just the math formulas above their head. That's what I picture at the start of an interview. Like you trying to calculate a little bit. What should I do here? How's this person? But it's all probably going on subconsciously, which is a cool point and kind of drives home something I've harped on this podcast before, that interviewing people is hard. It's not like an easy thing anyone can hop into. And it is the key. If you're looking for a customer testimonial, employee testimonial, you need a good interview or the video is just not going to be good. And there's no way around that. So what I want to dive into real quick is that all starts with having the right interview questions as well. Like a lot of part of it is interpersonal, like you said, making them comfortable, reading the room, but you also need to ask the right questions. So I'm curious, that's the other kind of half of your job, right? Is writing questions all the time.
Yeah.
I'm curious your process there. Like, how do you start when you ingest info about someone, about their company, then you have to write questions? What does that look like?
Our first step with anything that comes across our table is going to be research. We research both the person that we're interviewing and the company that we're interviewing them on behalf of. And this research is pretty thorough. It's pretty in-depth. It goes beyond checking out a website or two. We are trying to look up past articles. We're trying to look up Forbes magazine articles if we can find any. We are really trying to figure out what each company is, what their vibe is. And it also goes into not only knowing what the company is and what the company does, but also what their branding is like, so that we can match branding on that level, right? If this is a more serious company, it's going to be a more serious interview. If this is a company that is fun and playful in their branding and their advertising, then we can maybe have a little more fun with the questions we ask or the ways that we approach it. So there is a lot of research on the front end that has to happen first before we even get to what questions we're going to ask. Then we coordinate it with our client directly. What are their goals? What do they want to see? We have really cool creative briefs that come to us from directly from the client telling us this would be my dream sentence, or this is really what we want to talk about, or this product that we've just put out is really important to us. So again, anything that is revealed in the creative brief is going to get researched as well. We're going to we're going to study that and figure out how we can achieve that. And then we finally get to the writing question. And the questions themselves will ask directly about whatever the client has said is most important to them. But, and this is an interesting thing, I don't know if this really matters to you, but I am an interview nerd, so it matters to me. In certain interviews, your objectives are different. So in a testimonial style interview, when I'm asking questions, I'm going to ask them in a particular way that I can get the best soundbite because I know that's what we're going to be using. Whereas if you're writing an article or maybe you're having a Barbara Walters style, that's going to be different. The way you ask those questions and the way that you even phrase the questions that you ask are going to be entirely different than the way that I approach it when I'm approaching a testimony. So that is also something that you have to put into it because we do have a lot of people who maybe are really successful at doing case studies and asking case study questions. Or we've had people who have interviewed people for TED Talks and again, those are different styles. So when you're doing a testimonial, your objectives are slightly different. So you're writing the questions and you're coming up with the phrasing in a way that's going to make the best soundbite that the person can easily repeat in an accessible way. And then we're all sorry, this is a long answer and I'm sorry. But there is a lot that goes into it. Okay. But yeah, you want to make it an easy and accessible way for the person to access these questions and repeat them back to you. And then also just the format of the questions, what question you're going to ask first versus what question you're going to ask last. The order in which those questions are asked is also going to be pretty crucial to the vibe of the interview. When a person is first starting an interview, they are probably a little more closed down and unsure of what topics they're really addressing. So you're going to ask very easy, you called them once, I think you called them softballs. In one of your you give them the softballs first. You throw the softball pitches at them first. You give them some easy home runs. And then we start to get into the more nitty gritty. And then at the end of the interview, you're ending with more bigger picture, higher level questions. Do you like this company? Would you recommend them? Those are the bigger ones that you will. So it has a little bit of levels. There's a little bit of a wave to a question set that we are always taking into account and trying to allot for whenever we're doing these.
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting, even with the softballs, is you really notice how easy it is to flub the start of an interview. Because I don't know how many times I've seen your interview where they can't introduce themselves. Like they mess up their name or where they're from or what their company does. Then at the end, they nail it, right? But I've noticed there, you get that one out of the way and be like, yeah, we'll come back to that later. And then throw an easier one, which is an interesting way to do it. The other question I wanted to ask, and I've noticed this, I think in some of the interviews I've seen from you, is you'll ask a similar-ish question at different stages or different parts of the interview. What's the thought process behind that? And then how does that benefit kind of the final product?
Well, see, I do this a lot when it comes to the pain points or the challenges that the person is experiencing. When we first start the interview, we ask a question like, what pain points or challenges were you facing before you found this customer, right? And that gives them an opportunity to go back in time and ask and think about, okay, this is how it looked before them, and this is what we were running up against, and that type of thing. But then later in the question set, we always come back to it and we say, okay, what were the pain points and challenges you were facing, and how do they look different now? So now they get to do a before and after, because now they've gone through the entire question set. They've talked about how they started and the product and how great the product is, and how they've talked about numbers and how this product has increased their numbers and how it's increased team productivity and all sorts of things. And then they get to come back to, oh yeah, this is where we started. This is the challenges. And now this is where we're at. And so not only is it a really great kind of bow, a nice little way to wrap up an interview, giving them that closure, it's also really cool to see the way that question sort of morphs throughout the 20 minutes of time that you have with them. it started very, maybe a little bit nihilistic, where they were like, oh, these were our challenges and it was awful. And then you lead them on that journey about everything they've been through. And at the end, you ask something similar, but slightly different. And they're like, no, wait, we did have those challenges, but this company, this product has been really amazing for us. This process has been transformative. This is, okay. And you're ending on a completely different note. So we do that a lot. And that's a tactic that we use a lot in subtly different ways. But it also is really beneficial because you never know what soundbite is going to be good for that particular part of the buyer's process, right? There might be videos that we can produce that talk about that negative, really tough part of the pain points and challenges without this thing. And that might be really crucial. And then as you want to move your buyers through the process and show them the happy ending, you might want another video completely different, but in that same frame about, hey, this is where you've been and this is where you could go with us. It's really cool to ask questions like that because we're getting content for every part of your buyer's journey.
Yeah. And as someone who's on the far end of kind of the process of creating one of these, so you do the work of interviewing them, etc. Then the editing team, actually before the editing team gets it, I go through the transcript and you can, because I know like our process, I can see like, oh, they asked this one to get to this point, and I would use that with my sales team or my marketing team. So it's cool to see that. But that's one thing, like every sales call, I have harped on this, and it probably annoys people that like you're doing a 45-minute interview. Why do you just want one 90-second video out of it? There's so much gold that I have to leave on the cutting room floor, even when I do a bunch of videos. So I think just, something to think through there is you don't always just need this one polished video. You probably want a few different ones from the same interview, and it's just more bang for your buck that way.
100%. I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And then the one question I do want to ask here is, so when I'm interviewing, sometimes I get a follow-up question in my head and then I concentrate on the follow-up question too much and then it screws everything up. So I'm curious, do you come into an interview with a list of like potential follow-up questions, either written down or in your head? Just because I know that's a big part of the interviews is they say a little nugget of gold and you want to jump on that and dive in. So curious, do you prepare those in advance or
This is going to be, every interviewer is going to answer this question differently because it's a process question. It's how each person chooses to process the information they're receiving in real time. For me, I am very confident in our question set. We usually have about 15 to 20 questions that we ask. And usually what happens more often than not is that they will bring up something and I'll want to ask them a follow-up question, but I know we're going to hit it a little later in the question set. Yeah. And I don't want to get us off track of what I've already set up for us. So for the most part, what I'll do is I'll make a note, I'll write it down. And then if we organically hit it throughout the question set, perfect. If we don't, I will ask it as an extra credit question before we do our wrap-up work with the person. But it's a very good question. And I think it would change based on the interviewer that you ask.
Yeah, totally. I do a similar thing, actually. If I ever look off this way, I'm looking at something I jotted down while you were talking, because if I try to keep it in my head, I'm just not going to hear what you're saying. I just hear my own voice in my head. Awesome. This has been great. I do want to wrap it up with one last question. It's maybe a hard one. This is not a softball for sure, but do you have a favorite go-to interview question?
Favorite interview question? One of my favorites to ask is, what is at risk if you don't use blank? So we're usually asking about certain products or certain companies. So what is at risk if you don't use this company? And those are really high impact questions. I like to call them high impact questions because 9.5 times out of 10, you're getting a great soundbite from it. You're getting somebody being like, wow, if we didn't have so-and-so, we would risk all this. It's a really good, succinct way to, and it's a really good wrap-up question too. I usually use it. It was one of my last 3 or 4 questions because it's a really good way to reprioritize why they're there in the first place. A lot of times when we interview people, they come into us and they say, I would not be here if it wasn't for this company. I don't do these interviews. I don't believe in them, but for this company, I will do it. And when you have that kind of energy, be it people who don't like being interviewed and are only there because they truly believe in the product, then you really do want to treat it with the gravitas that it deserves. And you want to be able to ask those questions in the right order to make sure that not only do they see that you see them, they're also being like, oh yeah, that's right. That's why I'm here. I would be risking all of this if I didn't have this company. Yeah. So that's one of my favorites.
That's awesome. Yeah. For anyone in sales listening, you probably heard that as like cost of inaction.
Yep.
This is a great way to get your customer talking about cost of inaction. It's another one I plug during sales calls as well, because it's a good question. Like I like those videos. I think they work well. So Heather, thanks so much. That was awesome. I learned a lot about interviewing. Normally when I talk about interview, I'm just stealing stuff that like you and the other CPs have talked about. So appreciate you coming on. You get it right from your mouth here. Normally I would say if there's anything you want to plug, but we work for the same company. I'm just going to plug that we have a course that just came out on the website that goes over a bunch of this, how to write interview questions, how to ask interview questions. I'm the voice of it. It's all from their brains. So it's all good stuff, but definitely check that out. And Heather, thanks so much for joining me.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. Have a great one.
Thanks for listening. My key takeaway from this episode is just how much of an art and a science interviewing is. There are a ton of quick judgment calls being made at any given moment in any interviewer's brain as they're thinking through how to make the person comfortable, what questions to ask, and a lot more. So, I mean, the bottom line here is it's hard to interview people. It's a learned skill. So if you're interviewing your customers, get an expert to do it. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts to leave us a review. It helps us get discovered, and I really appreciate it. And as always, I'll be back next week with a new episode.